Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. We want to thank our sponsor, Siemens Mobility, maker of excellent trains running all across the country. And they allowed us to have this great conversation with Seth Moulton, who is a key champion towards high-speed rail. So let's get started. This is Rick Harish. I'm the executive director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. And thank you all so much for joining us today. For those who are new to the organization, we're a member-supported organization seeking to answer the questions, what is high-speed rail? Why do we need to build it? And what steps need to be taken to make it happen? So we're very excited to have a very special guest today. He's been in the House of Representatives for 10 years and has been the biggest champion for high-speed rail we've seen since Senator Pell, which got the high-speed rail discussion started in 1964/65. So I appreciate that you're on the T&I committee, which is the critical committee for setting railroad policy. And just want to jump right in and ask a question that lots of people have asked. Given Tuesday, what are our outcomes for, or what can we expect over the next couple of years?
Well, Rick, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and quite an honor with that introduction, because Pell was certainly a high-speed rail giant, but we got a lot of work ahead of us. And I wish I could tell you, I often say this, I wish I could tell you that there were 50 greater advocates for high-speed rail in Congress. But, you know, you're stuck with me. But we are building our support. And I think what Tuesday tells us is that it is most important, absolutely imperative, that we build our support across the aisle. I mean, look, Republicans control everything in Congress now, everything in Washington. I mean, even the Supreme Court, they essentially control. So this can no longer just be a Democratic issue. This has been a focus of mine for some time. I have been working to build bipartisan support for high-speed rail. I'm going to be honest with you. I can't tell you that we have a massive track record of success. But one of the reasons why I have been such a consistent, longtime champion of the Texas project, since just literally working on the project before I ran for Congress, is because I think that Texas would change the politics of high-speed rail across the country. We know that Texas has a lot of quiet support from Republicans in the state who know that it would be transformative for the Texas economy. If we can turn them into vocal supporters by having a rail line that they can champion and that everyone loves to ride, then that will transform the politics of high-speed rail in Washington. And all of a sudden, it could become a bipartisan issue. We know it makes sense. We know the economics make sense. We know that cities across America need this service, but it doesn't go anywhere at the federal level because only Democrats champion it, and we don't do enough. This is the opportunity to change that.
Well, you talked about Texas, and I agree with you. It's to have a cluster, a triangle of such very important cities so close together that aren't linked. If they became linked, it would be transformative. I've said for a while that it's not high speed in Florida, but Brightline Florida is fantastic regional rail. And do you think that has changed the conversation at all yet?
I do.
Okay.
I do, and I can tell you, like, individual colleagues who have changed their position on this. I'm thinking in particular of a certain South Florida representative, a Republican, who was completely opposed to Brightline and has now become quietly, slowly but surely, a supporter. And that's because Brightline was smart enough to try to work with him to win him over. He was very ornery and difficult. But now I don't want to call him a champion yet, but he's at least on Brightline's side. I don't think he's ready to be a champion in Congress, but that's exactly the kind of work that can be done when you have high-speed rail service in Republican areas. And so while I love the high-speed projects across the country, I'm not even afraid to defend California. In fact, I did a whole financial analysis of the California high-speed rail project when I was a business school student. And incidentally, the conclusion at the time was it's going to cost a lot more money than people say. Well, that was right. And also, it's still going to be a lot less expensive than the alternatives, building more airports and highways. That's a part of the case that they don't make enough. But it's a long way of saying that I'm a champion for high-speed rail projects all across America, but I'm keenly conscious of the politics of this. And we've got to win Republicans over. The best way to do that is by delivering high-speed rail, true high-speed rail, to Republican districts across America.
Well, I was at the Bright Line West opening, which will be a high-speed line, and I truly hope that they meet that very aggressive target of 2028. But the Republican governor there, and I forgot his name. Uh,
So,
he's
so
bragging
that's
about
right. There are
it.
some Republican politicians out there, which is helpful. Again, I'm a champion of Brightline West. It's amazing that this true high speed rail project is actually getting built. So let's not gloss over what a milestone this is, what an achievement it will be when it's completed. I do worry a little bit that some people still see California as just a Democratic state, even though we know it has a lot of Republican reps, and Las Vegas in particular as just sort of this, unique, almost amusement park kind of place. And so just because it works in Vegas doesn't necessarily means it's going to work everywhere else. So I worry that people might still think that this is sort of a one-off success as opposed to a project that can be repeated throughout America. But simply having a true high-speed train for people to actually ride without going overseas, I do think will be huge in moving forward the discussion.
So you mentioned California a couple of times. They've had what I believe to be the only truly effective uh, and forward-thinking rail program at the state level. And they started working on that, both high-speed and regional rail and commuter rail in 1990. And they've demonstrated a lot of the key things that we need: frequency, constant improvement, um, and now integration. And I've been challenged in, it's very hard to have that conversation because our opponents have done such a good job of whacking at California high-speed rail. But what arguments do you think are effective at making the case for California high-speed rail beyond the cost, or if that's the cost savings, or if that is it, how do we make that argument better?
The single most effective argument in my experience is this simple fact that it is still less expensive than the alternatives, because people are very focused on the cost. One of the broader problems with high speed rail projects is we only talk about the cost and don't talk about the benefits. So that's definitely another approach that we should think about for California. But because people are so focused on the cost in California, and there's a really great cost argument for the project, which again is that it's cheaper than building the airports and highway expansions you would need to meet 2050 travel demand, if you didn't have this high-speed rail line. I think that's just where you should really rest the case. And I'm just surprised that I don't hear that argument more often. I have used that argument in high-speed rail debates on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and it's pretty darn effective.
Um, well, the big challenge there is the tunnels. So we do need a much bigger program in order to get the Central Valley done, which I think was the best place to get started, and I'm excited that's working on. There's also a fantastic story to be told about they've actually got environmental clearance for the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
What truly transforms this is first getting under to the Tehachapi Mountains, but also through Pacheco Pass. So do you think, I'm not sure what the question is, but that's so important that we build the case for getting those funded quickly. How does that happen on a national level when it's really just one state?
Well, look, I mean, this is hard because this is a lot of money. Public-private partnerships are one thing that are absolutely key. And one of the things that's so important about Brightline West is that they are private efforts with, in the case of Brightline West, especially significant public sector contributions. but you see the level of skill and efficiency that's brought to these projects from the private sector. And that's something that we should celebrate and something that we should double down on, and something that I think, frankly, California could use more of. I do think that, I mean, I hear the argument, and not to get into this, not to get into the weeds here on this, but I certainly hear the argument for, hey, we had to start somewhere, and we could make some significant progress in the Central Valley. That's true, but I do think the best way to get high-speed rail going and expand its service is to actually get people riding trains. And so, if you look at countries that have done high-speed rail successfully across the world, a lot of them have taken the incremental approach of building high-speed rail lines for shorter distances, but getting people to ride them. And then they all want to go a little bit further. So this is what they've done in France, for example. The first high-speed rail line in France was relatively short, but as soon as people can go from Paris to Lyon, they're like, well, why can't we go a little further? And so one of the ways this applies to corridors across the country is illustrated by a debate that we're having here in Massachusetts. For those of you who know Massachusetts geography, you know that Boston is sort of the center of the economy and the population on the east, right on the eastern edge of the state. And then you have Worcester as a big city kind of in the middle of the state, and Springfield out west. Now, right now, it takes an hour plus, I don't know, well over an hour, I guess, to get from Worcester to Boston by train. And there's only a couple trains a day that go to Springfield. There's a proposal to do what's called West-East Rail and have service from Springfield to Boston on a more regular basis. But they're talking about a 1890s standard, 70 mile an hour, 2.5 hour trip that's significantly longer than driving. And frankly, the ridership studies show no one is going to take. My argument is take all that money that you're planning to spread out between Boston and Springfield to just modestly upgrade the old tracks and actually build proper high-speed rail for a much shorter distance. Because if people can take a high-speed train at 180, 200, 225 miles per hour from Worcester to Boston, trust me, they're going to ask to go to Springfield next. That's the approach that's been taken in other parts of the world. And I think it's a huge mistake on Amtrak's part. I'm not afraid to call them out on this because I've had a lot of discussions with their leadership and Stephen himself on this. I think it's a huge mistake to be championing all these century-old projects to bring trains up to speeds that, frankly, they had back in the 1930s, rather than focusing your money on shorter distances where you can get true high-speed rail speeds, get the people to love it, and then they will demand an expansion of service. So yeah, I like what California has done with their regional rail, but I think it's a shame that the trains that go between like I was a Marine station at Camp Pendleton, and so I lived in San Clemente, and taking the train from San Clemente to LA is convenient, as is San Clemente to San Diego. But those trains go the same speed or slower than the Santa Fe trains did in the 1930s. I mean, you would never expect American Airlines to start buying DC-3s or whatever that they used to fly in the 1930s. This is pathetic. We're 100 years out of date. So, yeah, California's done some good things, but at the same time as they're running trains at 1930s speeds to San Diego and LA, they're expanding I-5 at the cost of billions of dollars right alongside. That's not forward thinking. And that we've got to change that, I think, that approach to investing in rail across America.
And you brought up two important topics for me, but let's touch the third rail. So you talked about expanding I-5. We've talked about Texas, and Texas did a huge, or what I think a lot of people, if they paid attention, was a big increase in sales taxes, and took from general revenue to fund a huge expansion of their highways, which is causing significant damage to the finances and the quality of life in all of their major cities. Um, and so how do you get a state like that, which was posited at the beginning as critical to getting high-speed rail going nationally, to to start thinking differently about its highway program?
I don't think you do until you just get Texas Central built. And I wish I could convince you otherwise. I lived in Texas for a while when I was working on the project. They're incredibly backwards in their transportation thinking. Um, and I don't think you change that without showing people that this is better. Get on this high-speed train. Look, you can sit in 6 hours of traffic to go from Dallas to Houston, or you can get there in an hour, hour and a half. I'm a big champion for an hour. I think we should make that an hour. It's totally inside debate among the engineers for Texas Central, but get there in an hour, and people are going to say this is a better way to invest our money. The other thing I'll say is that I do think that you've got to tailor your argument to the politics of the population, and the reality is that if you're building high-speed rail in Massachusetts, the environmental benefits are a great argument. We're a state that really cares about our carbon footprint. We're trying to get to carbon-free energy. We have these carbon-free goals. We have these sustainability goals and everything. High-speed rail can fit squarely right into all of that and be a real part of our planning in that regard. But in Texas, they don't care about that much. They do care about their taxes. And if you tell Texans, Republicans in Texas, that the state is misusing your taxes because they're wasting money on highways that are just getting congested when you could be traveling 225, 250 miles per hour on a high-speed train and get there in a quarter or 20% the time, then I think Texans are going to wake up and say, yeah, let's invest our tax dollars more wisely.
So going back to Worcester. So one of the
Worcester, Rick, Worcester.
Sorry, Worcester. So we had the first national highway program started right around World War I. We kind of forget about that. But then FDR started planning on a national network of all-weather highways, which became the interstate highway system. So it started as a national planning effort in the Bureau of Public Roads, and then they negotiated with states through 1956, where we decided to increase our gas tax by today's equivalent of 80 cents to pay for it. But we don't have that big picture view at the national level. So if you look at Boston to Worcester to Albany, then Buffalo, Cleveland, Toledo, Chicago, with a branch up to Detroit, that becomes very exciting. But if there was a national plan, then you could, I think, more easily persuade the governor of Massachusetts that he should be thinking big on his segment.
Yeah, on hers in this case. Rick, I totally agree with you. I love this question because one of the myths about high-speed rail that I think we, as an alliance here, can help address. One of the myths is that high-speed rail works in places where cities are closer together, like Europe, but it doesn't work in America because cities are too far spread apart. And this is just totally wrong. Let me just give you my stock explanation for why. No one is really talking about taking a high-speed train from Boston to LA or even from Chicago to LA. But if you look at all the high-speed rail corridors around the United States that make sense, they're contiguous. So in other words, they touch. So like take Chicago to LA, for example. No, most people are not going to take a high-speed train that distance because it's faster to fly. But people will take high-speed rail from Chicago to Omaha. People will take high-speed rail from Omaha to Denver to Salt Lake City. People will take high-speed rail from Salt Lake City through Vegas to California. And so it turns out that all these individual high-speed rail corridors that make a lot of sense because they're 4 or 5 hours travel time or less, you put them all together and you have a national network. So I agree with the premise of your argument, which is that we should make the national argument. I agree with you that it would be far better if we had federal policy, which is why I have the High-Speed Rail Act, the American High-Speed Rail Act in Congress, which would help develop these national standards and create a national network and make it much easier for states to decide individually, hey, yeah, it makes sense to build high-speed rail from Boston to Worcester. but we need to think of that as part of a Boston-Chicago high-speed rail line in the future once all the pieces get put together. Again, this is the way France did it, right? Like they would buy, I remember taking high-speed rail in France 20 years ago, and you would get on a high-speed rail train out of Paris, and at some point it would slow down because it would go on conventional tracks. They were still electrified. They could still support the high-speed train, but it would go at conventional speeds. And then over time, they've upgraded those lines so that now the high speed service goes further. So I could imagine 10 years from now taking a high speed train from Boston to Albany, but then after Albany, it suddenly goes slower on the rest of the way to Chicago, and it takes another 10 years to complete the segments between Albany and Chicago. It would make a lot of sense if you were building east from Chicago at the same time as you're building west from Boston, so that people could commute to a job in Chicago from South Bend. But you get those shorter trips, and then eventually you get a line that is complete from Boston to Chicago, and all of a sudden, instead of an airplane trip that by the travel time in the air is still shorter, but when you add in all the delays, especially weather delays, remember this is why the New York Central water level route was so popularized 100 years ago, because they said we would go in all the weather. Well, now you have a totally reliable 4 or 5 hour service between Boston and Chicago that would be extremely popular with a lot of Americans. Downtown to downtown, totally reliable service, not stuffed in aluminum tube, pressurized aluminum tube, 30,000 feet in the air, hoping the door won't blow out, as I like to say. That would be a really appealing service. But I'm trying to lay out how you can imagine it coming together in incremental steps and eventually building a national network, even though the argument up front isn't for a national network from the start. The argument is build these individual corridors that make sense between certain city pairs.
Yeah, and there's that weird, we've got to do both, right? Because, you mentioned
Yeah.
on
Yeah,
this.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
Yeah, because right now the FRA is doing design work on the first 90 miles east out of Chicago, right? Are they planning for high-speed rail in that discussion? I don't know, because most of the states aren't.
Yeah, I mean, the FRA is so behind on this. I'm sorry. I'm not gonna. I work with the FRA. We've got it. But the idea that Amtrak and the FRA should be planning again 1920s level service is just utterly ridiculous. They should only be planning high-speed rail, except for the places where the populations are just so low that it's not going to make sense for the foreseeable future. I mean, like the next 50 years to invest in high-speed service. But certainly anywhere coming out of Chicago, it's crazy and insane not to be planning to high-speed rail standards. I mean, imagine if we're building the major highways, like you built I-90, right? The interstate highway between Boston and Chicago, and a bunch of states around along the way just said, well, yeah, let's just make it a 30-mile-per-hour highway. Or what if the National Highway Administration were saying the same thing? Yeah, we're just going to design it to 30 miles per hour. We know that's totally out of the date with the times, but we're just not convinced that, people are really going to want to go 65 miles per hour in an automobile. I mean, that's essentially what FRA is saying. It's insane.
I agree with you.
And by the way, let me just highlight another really important place where this is the case, because I brought this up in the Transportation Committee. North Carolina is talking about a higher speed line from Washington down to North Carolina. It is insane that they are building this or planning this right now, engineering it to like 100, 125 mile per hour standards. I mean, that would just be like building a new interstate tomorrow to 35 mile per hour standards. It's so stupid.
I agree with you. But, part of their challenge is you got to have Virginia stepping up, and it's really hard to get electrified tracks from DC to Richmond. So that's where I come back to this. We need a stronger federal program that's thinking bigger.
I mean, God, what country do we live in that we say that's hard, Rick? It's not hard. Come on. This is the United States of America. We sent a man to the moon 50 years ago. We can't electrify a railroad to Richmond?
I agree with you. We should have an electrified railroad from Atlanta to Boston. It should already be there. And I'm really frustrated that Virginia and North Carolina are not working on it, despite getting relatively large, but really
Well,
small.
look, this is why this discussion is so important, because hopefully we have people on the line here who are from these states, right, and can be really focused on these things. I think that, you know, strategically, the target right now is really North Carolina, because they're in the engineering phase. And I've had rail consultants tell me, yes, this is insane that they are engineering this to 125 miles per hour. This is going to be one of my priorities. And I know Katie and my team are listening to what I'm saying here. This is going to be one of my priorities in the next few months, is just to get North Carolina straightened out. Because they're about to make an epic mistake that will last for 50, 100 years if they don't just smarten up and engineer this to modern standards, just basic modern standards.
I agree with you, and thank you very much for taking that on. We will help any way we can on that effort.
Thanks.
You know, they are planning high-speed rail from Charlotte to Atlanta. Not as seriously, but it should go all the way up to
Yeah.
Washington.
And
So
by the way, just again, because this is the United States of America, like, why do we even have 186 miles per hour as a standard? Because that was the standard 40 years ago, 40 years ago, basically, part of the 1980 standard. I mean, come on. Like, China's at 250. Is our policy in the United States of America that we will have high-speed rail, but we will deliberately make it slower than China?
it is today, but I don't
I
want
mean,
that.
I mean, should we be I'm on our services committee too. Should I tell our DOD, hey, when you're designing the next fighter jet, let's make sure it's slower than China's?
No, you should not. And
Okay.
yet, I absolutely agree. It's time. You know, I do remember in 2011 being really excited to go ride the first train that in revenue service ran 220 miles an hour, and it was from Hong Kong to Wuhan. So
Yeah.
I am a little frustrated with this very slow progress. Now it is 11 or noon your time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've got to jump off. I've got a super jam day, and I'm up in Massachusetts right now, but about to go to Washington. And guess how I'm going to get there? I'm going to get on a plane. Even though this is a distance that should be high speed rail, I should be able to get on a train in Salem, connect seamlessly through a rail link in the center of Boston that would complete the Northeast corridor. In other words, what I should be able to do, this is how the journey should look. I should be able to walk 10 minutes down the street to the Salem train station, get on a train that would be in downtown Boston in 20 minutes, get off that train if it's not going all the way to New York, because it's probably a regional train that's going to somewhere on the South Shore, wait on the same southbound platform for the next train to New York to come through from Maine, and get on that high-speed train that will go to New York and get me to Washington in 3 hours. Not a weather delay. And if I miss a train by 2 minutes, I'll have to wait 13 for the next one. Because if we had 3-hour service between Boston and Washington, no one would fly anymore, which means the market would support high-speed trains every 15 minutes. That's the future. That's the future that we've got to sell to America. And it's reality in so many parts of the rest of the world. Not just fancy places like Tokyo, but Morocco. Morocco has high-speed rail. We can do this, America, and we've just got to get some more people on board. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak to your group. You're doing important work, and I'm a huge supporter, obviously, a huge champion, and I'll continue to be an ally. We got to work together on this.
I appreciate that vision. Absolutely, that's what I'm working for. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you to Siemens for sponsoring this event. And let us know how we can help, Congressman, and we will. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.